This is Phil Chenevert, putting on my microphone. With word origins number 12. And this one's going to be interesting. I was out walking yesterday morning in the cool, crisp air of the quarantine still going on. But it was cool and it was beautiful and the sun was shining and I was doing my walk around the neighborhood. That's the only physical activity I get. And my brain started working. You know, our brains are connecting devices. They connect things. You think red, you think fire truck. It goes to fire, it goes to hospitals. We make instantaneously millions of connections all the time. Well, my brain started working about the fact that I don't have any deadlines. Not a one. I don't have any reports to write. I don't have anything that, it's got to be done by a certain day. That's what deadline means. And of course, I said, well, deadline, a line that's dead. I wonder where that came from. Well, of course, I knew where that came from. It just brought it back to my mind. So I started with that. A deadline, of course, is for a project of some time. The last time period when it can be done. That's what it's evolved to. But it began about 150 years ago in the American Civil War, which that ghastly unpleasantness. Toward the end of the war, 1863, 64, there were vast numbers of prisoners being taken, and they had to make these prisoner camps in the North and the South. Well, the South had the most infamous prison camp called Andersonville, where I don't know how many, 50,000, a lot of troops were stationed. Well, the poor South, was straining to feed its citizens and is straining to actually get its soldiers up there. So it didn't have a lot. Let me put this light on my face. Cool. So there weren't a lot of guards. So the commander decided that these prisoners, thousands of, they can easily overtake us. They can easily rush us. So what he did was he established the stockade with the logs put in the ground. He established a line about 10 feet in from that stockade. He put that line there, and he said anybody between that line and the wall is will be shot dead if you step a foot over that line. Well, to make it more obvious, they even put up a small fence so that the guards could see. If you approached that line or touched it, you were shot dead. And of course, this was to prevent them even approaching the stockade walls. Now, this was written about, correspondence. Local people would write letters to their family telling prisoners who kept diaries about this horrible line, and they called it the deadline. And it got into the newspapers. And the newspapers reported this, and that's how that phrase came into our being. The line that says, that's it, folks. This is where the project has to be completed, or this is the deadline for doing things. Goes back to the Civil War deadline where you would be shot dead if you touched that line or that little low fence they put up there. Now from that, my brain switched and thought about newspapers. These newspapers at the time were huge. I mean, every community had the big newspapers. That's how news was developed. And they couldn't obviously have reporters all over the country. If there was a big trial in left-wing Arkansas, then the local person there would write a story and would get connections with, let's say, the Chicago Tribune or the New York Herald, all these newspapers, and they would write the story, send it in, and then the newspapers knew that they could write, so there was kind of an informal agreement there. And they weren't paid until the end of a certain time period, in which case they would add up the amount of column that actually made it into the big newspaper, and they were paid by the inch, the line, stringer. They had a string with knots in it. They could easily just say, okay, he did 36 inches of column for me. He gets so much. She wrote this much, and they would get so much. So the word stringer, which we don't use that much anymore, but stringer comes from the string that was used to measure their columns and by which they got paid. You know that. Now, actually, my mind went a little bit further than that. I started thinking about newspapers. Newspapers. Somebody had to set that type for all these columns, millions and millions of words and sentences that were put out in newspapers. Some of them were dailies. Somebody had to sit down and take this text and work backwards. They couldn't do it they would put individual letters, S, P, A, E, space. They would put these letters into this block and then lock it into place. And these movable type would then be used to print the newspaper. However, for things that were like, my brain went to that, stereotype. This is where that word came from. For things that were going to be printed a lot, pamphlets, some documents, maybe government documents, they would cast the whole sheet into one block of lead with the letters. And that way you could do millions of copies or thousands of copies. They could reprint it, but unfortunately that block was set. You couldn't use that type again. And stereo comes from the Greek word solid, and it means one solid block of type. From that, we've developed our stereotype. Stereotype, puppy dogs are unconditionally lovers and cats are aloof. Stereotypes about races and peoples and climates, Southerners are slow. Yes, we are. These stereotypes moved from the fact that this type was set to our mindset about certain types of things, foods, peoples, and places. Our stereotype comes from the solid type. Now that leads to one more, led my brain to one more thing. I started thinking about the word stereo and solid. When I was a little boy, we had, I shouldn't make mouth noises, big LPs, long playing records, and they invented something called stereophonic sound. You'd put it on and you'd hear the train coming, boo, 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 and it would go past you, come in this ear and go out the other ear. It's amazing. Oh, wow. And they called it stereophonic sound. And the reason they called it that was because of the earlier invention of something called the stereopticon, which was a thing you could put up to your eyes, and the two pictures were different lengths, so it made it look like it was in depth or solid rather than a two-dimensional thing. So from that, got a shadow on my face. So from that, we developed the word stereo to mean something that's three-dimensional. And then they picked up that word to use in stereophonic. So I always thought stereo meant two, because you had two tracks. It really just means solid. That's it, folks. And from there, I'm not going to tell you where my brain went. But this is the story of Word Origins number 12. And thank you. Sorry it's so long.